I would make the argument that I was right, that if we had not expanded NATO into Ukraine, Ukraine would be intact today. In all likelihood, it would include Crimea as well.
Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. I'm delighted to be joined today by one of our favourite guests. It's Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago. And we're going to be talking mostly about Ukraine. But John, I wanted to start by asking you about a story that caught my eye last week because it had your name in it. And that's that Jeffrey Epstein and Professor Alan Dershowitz, who's another occasional guest on this podcast, in the mid-2000s, they discussed a very famous essay, which then turned into a book that you and Stephen Waltz wrote, which was called The Israel Lobby. And it was about the influence of Israel over American foreign policy. And I think it's fair to say it riled up quite a few people at the time. But I think it's established now as a pretty important work, if I don't sound like too much of a flatter in saying that. And the story was, for viewers and listeners who aren't aware, that Epstein and Dershowitz were sort of consulting each other on how to debunk it or attack it. What did you make of this story?
Well, Alan Dershowitz was one of our principal foes when we wrote the article in the London Review of Books, and then when we wrote the book itself a year later. And he tried to smear us at every turn as anti-Semites and as hostile not only to Israel's interests, but America's interests. I had no idea that he was coordinating his efforts in any way with Jeffrey Epstein. I knew that he was one of Jeffrey Epstein's lawyers, so I knew that there were close relations by definition between the two of them. But I had no idea that he had gone to Epstein for help on writing the piece and on circulating it. So I was actually quite surprised when I saw the revelations in these emails that the two of them had been working together to smear me and Steve Walt.
And I mean, in a curious way, that story sort of proves an element of your thesis in the Israel lobby, which is that there are very rich and powerful people that don't like Americans to talk about the influence that Israel has over American foreign policy. Is that not right?
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. As the drop site piece that came out, which put this all out in the public, said, there's no question that what Dershowitz and Epstein were doing just confirmed the basic thesis of the book, that you have very influential people and very influential organizations that are bent on shutting down discourse on Israel. It's very important to understand that for years, the lobby, and this includes, of course, people like Alan Dershowitz and Jeffrey Epstein, were very successful at preventing a meaningful discourse about Israel, about the lobby, and about the U.S.-Israeli relationship in public in the United States and in Europe as well, I would argue. And what you see with Dershowitz and Epstein was part of that effort to suppress discourse. And they were very successful for a long time. But if you contrast the situation when we wrote the article in 2006 and then the book in 2007 with the present situation, it's quite clear that we cut the corridor. We opened up the debate a bit back in those days. And since then, and especially after October 7th, the debate about Israel and criticism of Israel has broken out in the public in ways that I did not imagine would happen so quickly.
Well, yes, I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, obviously, there's quite a lot of it on the left of American politics, but you're also seeing it increasingly on the right, and there's a lot of concern in Republican circles about, well, there does seem to be some very vulgar, crude anti-Semitism happening on the kind of political media right. But there's also a division in Trump circles, I'd say, about where America's relationship with Israel is and how America deals with Israel, particularly when it comes to policy in the Middle East.
I think there's no question about that. Up until October 7th, really almost all the criticism of Israel that was out in the open came from the left-hand side of the political spectrum. But what's happened since October 7th, and it's really quite remarkable, is that I would say the harshest criticism of Israel now comes from the right-hand side of the political spectrum. And it's inside the MAGA movement where you really see it. If you listen to people like Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and all sorts of other people, you see that these individuals are as tough on Israel as anybody on the left. And what is so disturbing to people in the lobby and to Israel itself is that these critical arguments are spreading like wildfire. And given Israel's behavior, especially in Gaza, but even in the West Bank, and the fact that it's available for everybody to see on the internet. I mean, this is the big problem that the Israelis face. There's hardly anything they do these days that's not publicly exposed. And the end result is that the Israelis end up looking like the bad guys. And of course, they are the bad guys for the most part. And the end result is that this is doing enormous damage to Israel's reputation, not only on the left, but on the right.
Well, I mean, there are quite a few bad guys in the Middle East. And do you think perhaps another aspect of this might be that Gulf states, in particular, have developed their own lobbies? And this is something Israel's very sensitive about, but it's also true that, the UAE, Saudi, Qatar, they have figured out how to fund the right groups, how to influence media in America. And they are now pushing their own agendas quite effectively through Washington.
That may be true, Freddie, but the point is that those countries are in bed with the Israelis. They're not acting counter to Israel's interests.
Well, Qatar would be another nation that a lot of people say, I mean, Tucker Carlson, who's been quite a vocal critic of certainly the America-Israel relationship, he's now called Tucker Carlson and so on. It's a sort of slur that's thrown at him for his views.
Yeah, I know that there's been a lot of criticism of Qatar, but you want to remember that Benjamin Netanyahu was working with Qatar to fund Hamas and keep Hamas in power before October 7th. The idea that Qatar is some sort of rogue country that's interested in countering Israel's interests vis-a-vis the Palestinians is simply not true. Basically, the United States and Israel own the Gulf states. I mean, this is why you have the Abraham Accords in countries like UAE, like the UAE, and why the United States and Israel are working overtime to get an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. In no way are these countries a threat to what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians.
Well, first of all, thank you for correcting my pronunciation of Qatar. I always want to say Qatar, but it's Qatar is the correct pronunciation, is it not?
I think that's usually the way it's pronounced, Freddie, is Qatar, but I've heard it pronounced by all sorts of people in different ways.
But I wanted to ask you lastly on this, and then we'll move on to Ukraine, because I think that's the more pressing story at the moment. But lastly, there is this, you see a bit of it online, there is quite a vicious anti-Semitism, I think, festering in the American political conversation at the moment. Do you worry that perhaps, if there'd been a healthier debate when your book had come out, we wouldn't necessarily have this avid suspicion, this paranoia about Jews in Israel that we now see coming to the fore again?
Well, first of all, I think there's no question that there is a real threat of anti-Semitism. And many of my Jewish friends worry greatly about where this is headed. They believe if the situation since October 7th continues into the future, the foreseeable future, that the growth of real anti-Semitism will be a major problem, not only for Jews in the diaspora, but for Israel itself. So this is a key issue. I think there's no doubt about it. If we had an open debate about Israel and you didn't have a lobby that went around trying to shut down the discourse and was so busy influencing policymakers to the point where they have no choice but to support Israel unreservedly, that would go a long way towards alleviating this potential problem. But that's not what's happened here. And if you think about what's going on in the United States, because there is so much criticism of Israel, the lobby has been forced out into the open, and it's been forced to engage in smash mouth politics. And everybody sees what's happening. And this causes huge amounts of trouble for Israel and supporters of Israel. Just to give you one really good example, look at what's happening on college and university campuses. In the spring of 2024, you had all these protests across the United States on campuses against the genocide in Gaza. And the lobby moved in and they went to great lengths to shut down not only those protests, but any criticism of Israel. It's quite remarkable if you walk around major universities today, how little criticism there is of Israel. Everybody's afraid to speak out. And the universities themselves feel that they're under threat. And it's because rich donors, moved in and told these universities and colleges that if they didn't shut down the criticism of Israel, those rich donors would withdraw support for those universities. And they convinced their friends to stop giving money to those universities. And then those rich donors went to the Trump administration and they worked with the Trump administration to threaten to cut off funding or to actually cut off funding to universities where there was any criticism of Israel. This is a threat to free speech. This is not a situation you want. And virtually everybody who operates on a university or college campus today knows that you can't talk about Israel without running the risk that something serious will happen to you. This is not a good situation.
Is that really true, though, John? Because, I mean, you know American academia far more than me, but it seems to me that there has been quite a lot of anti-Israel sentiment expressed on campuses throughout America.
Not much anymore, Freddie. There was in early 2024. There's no question about that, but it has basically been shut down. You just walk around the University of Chicago campus, you don't see any posters pushing the Palestinian cause, any posters that are critical of Israel. You don't see outside speakers coming in and slamming Israel for what's going on in Gaza. People are afraid. And Shibli Telhami at the University of Maryland has done surveys of academics that show that, well over 75% of academics, this is in the United States, self-censor when it comes to talking about Israel. Everybody understands that the lobby will put its gun sights on you and try to punish you in significant ways if you get too hostile toward Israel.
Well, as discussed, we don't want to spend all this podcast talking about Israel or Jeffrey Epstein, for that matter. But I would like to talk about Ukraine, because I think that's the big story of the last few days in terms of foreign policy in America. Thanksgiving has come and gone, and the Trump administration has not yet achieved a peace deal. It did unveil, or it didn't unveil, actually. The 28 point peace plan was leaked a couple of weeks ago now. And that went down very badly, I think it's fair to say, with Europeans, with a lot of the media, and with the Ukrainians, of course, who felt that it was a sellout to Putin. And the deal appeared to be sort of dead on arrival. Steve Witkoff has gone back to Russia today, I believe. Where do you think we are in the Ukrainian peace process?
Just to be very clear, Freddie, the 28-point peace plan that was leaked was dead on arrival with regard to the Russians as well. It was an unacceptable agreement to them.
That's what I found so contradictory, is that we had a lot of people saying this has been entirely dictated by Putin, but you had almost the same people saying, and Putin's never going to accept it anyway. If it was entirely dictated by Putin, why wouldn't he accept it?
Look, the Wall Street Journal ran a lengthy article describing the whole process of writing the 28-point peace proposal. And it's quite clear that what happened in mid October, after Witkoff and Jared Kushner had come up with a ceasefire plan for the Middle East, President Trump asked the two of them to come up with a plan for Ukraine. And the two of them did. And in the process of crafting that plan, where they were the two principal authors, this is Witkoff and Kushner, they talked to the Russians for sure, and they talked to the Ukrainians as well. They had at least two telephone conversations with Zelensky himself about this initial 28-point plan. So it's not like the Ukrainians and the Russians didn't have any input. They did. The problem with the plan, and this gets back to your point that it was dead on arrival to the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and I made the point that it was dead on arrival to the Russians, is that there's no way you can reach a meaningful peace agreement that satisfies both sides, because the Russian demands are unacceptable to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans and to the hardliners in the United States. And the Russians are simply unwilling to compromise on their principal demands. So there's no way you can put together an agreement that satisfies everybody and puts an end to this war. This is regrettable in the extreme, but this is the situation we face. There is no political solution to be had, and this one is going to be settled on the battlefield.
Well, and it seems as though, I mean, there are still conflicting reports about what's exactly going on the front lines. But it seems as though it could be quite close to being settled on the battlefield in favor of the Russians.
That's my view. And as you know, it's been my view for a long time. I mean, this is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, what really matters is the balance of manpower and the balance of firepower between the two sides. And the balance of manpower is decisively in the Russians' favor at this point. General Syrskyi, who, of course, is the head of the Ukrainian military, said about a month ago that the Russians outnumbered the Ukrainians up on the front lines about 3-1 overall. And in some places, they outnumbered the Russians. The Russians outnumbered the Ukrainians 6-1. Furthermore, in the Pokrovsk area, this is that city that's been a point of much attention in the media over the past few months. Zelensky himself has said that the Russians enjoy an 8-1 advantage in manpower. So that's just manpower. And by the way, just to expand on manpower, is the Ukrainians have a massive desertion problem. The reports are in the Ukrainian press that they lost 20,000 people through desertion in the month of October and are expected to lose somewhere around 100,000 people over the course of 2025. Furthermore, they have a huge number of draft dodgers. And they have no prospect of rectifying the manpower imbalance. And then if you turn to firepower, it's not even a fair fight. The Russians have all these sophisticated glide bombs. The Ukrainians have none. The Russians now dominate in terms of drone warfare. This was an area where the Ukrainians were number one for a long time, but the Russians now have an advantage in drones. And in terms of artillery, the Russians have long had somewhere on the order of a 5-1, 7-1, 10-1 advantage in artillery. So the Ukrainians are just terribly outnumbered, both in terms of manpower and in terms of firepower. And in a war of attrition, this is the kiss of death.
And that's another seeming paradox in the Ukrainian position, is that they do have this desertion problem. It feels like the nation is increasingly unable to fight this war unless it gets more funding, more military technology from America. Doesn't seem as though European funding is going to be enough to keep the Ukrainian war effort going. And the manpower problem is the big one, as you say. And yet, it's thought that if Zelensky accepts any peace deal, really, he could soon be ousted by a harder, more militaristic wing of Ukrainians who are absolutely adamant that they're not going to give up the fight.
Yes. I mean, I would just say, to come at this from a different angle, I have actually been surprised at the tenacity of the Ukrainians. I thought, given the devastation that their forces have suffered, given the fact that they're so badly outnumbered in terms of manpower and in terms of firepower, that they would have quit by now, that their army would have crumbled. But nevertheless, they continued to fight ferociously and stand up to the Russians. Uh, and at the same time, they have this huge desertion problem, and they have this huge problem of people leaving the country, draft dodgers, basically. So I think that what that tells you is that Ukraine is badly split on how to think about this war. There are a significant number of people who appear to be willing to fight and die to the last person and don't want to cut a deal with the Ukrainians with the Russians under any circumstances. And at the same time, there appears to be a huge number of people who don't think the fight is worth it and think it's time to quit.
And if it is this attritional war with no political solution in sight, but perhaps a military one on the horizon, what do you expect would happen then? I mean, does Russia end up toppling over the entire country? Does Russia win a few more bits of land that it wants to win in the next few months and declare the war is over? What are the realistic scenarios?
Well, I would just point out to you that the Russians can't just declare the war is over. The Ukrainians and their sponsors would have to agree as well. And you would have to have some sort of frozen peace or frozen conflict set in, something akin to what we saw in Korea after 1953.
There was a frozen conflict in Ukraine, you could say, from 2014 to 2022.
No, it was not frozen. In fact, in the Donbass, it was very hot.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of evidence that one of the reasons that the Russians went in on February 24th, 2022, is that the conflict in the Donbass was heating up. And you want to remember, Freddie, that we trained and armed the Ukrainian army after 2014. Remember, President Trump in 2017 was the American president who decided to arm the Ukrainians. So by 2022, the Ukrainian army was well trained and well armed, and it was beginning to launch a major offensive in the Donbass against the rebels, who were, of course, allied with the Russians. And many believe that this is one of the principal reasons that Putin invaded on February 24th of that year.
But I mean, when you say that, you would, of course, be accused of peddling Russian talking points.
I've been accused of peddling Russian talking points since 2014, making the argument that expanding NATO into Ukraine was going to precipitate a major crisis, if not war, that we would be responsible for. People didn't want to hear that then. They don't want to hear that now. And they say that basically I'm parroting Russian talking points. I would make the argument that I was right, that if we had not expanded NATO into Ukraine, Ukraine would be intact today. In all likelihood, it would include Crimea as well. It would be intact inside its pre-2014 borders. So I think that pushing Ukraine into NATO, or trying to push Ukraine into NATO, was the principal underlying cause of this conflict, which is not to deny for one second that it was Putin who invaded in February 2022.
To go back to that question of how does it end, as David Petraeus said of Iraq, if it is to be, as you say, a freezing of the conflict, what does that look like? Does it actually freeze the conflict? It seems to me quite unlikely, given what you said about the Donbass from 2014 to 2022. Is it possible for this conflict to be actually frozen for any serious period of time?
Well, it is possible that it'll be frozen. I mean, at some point, the Ukrainians are likely to say enough is enough. I mean, what the Russians are going to do between now and the time you get a frozen conflict is they're going to capture as much Ukrainian territory as possible. As you know, they've already annexed 4 oblasts and Crimea. And I think there's a real danger if this conflict isn't shut down that the Russians will end up conquering more territory. They have a vested interest from a purely strategic point of view in taking places like Odessa and Kharkiv. And they have a vested interest in making sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state, so that it's not a threat to them, and that it's not a threat to join NATO. So the longer this war goes on, the more damage that will be done to Ukraine. And at some point, I think the conflict will end. But I think what you were getting at, which I think is very true, is there's a real danger this would then heat up again at some point down the road, that frozen conflict would turn into a hot war again. I think that's a real danger. That's why it's so important to try to get a meaningful peace agreement here that settles this conflict once and for all. And Trump has tried to do that, but he has failed. And he failed because, as I said before, Russian demands are unacceptable to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. And the Russians are unwilling to compromise at this point in time. So I think the only possible outcome is where the Russians win an ugly victory and you get a frozen conflict. Now, a lot of people say, and this is especially true in the West, that what's going to happen is that Russia is going to try to conquer all of Ukraine. I actually don't believe that. I think it would be foolish in the extreme for the Russians to try to conquer all of Ukraine. I don't think they have enough troops to do that. And the resistance from the Ukrainians over time would be enormous and not in Russia's interest. So I think at most, the Russians will end up taking probably about 42% of Ukrainian territory and annexing it over time to Russia.
It seems that one of the thorniest points in the negotiations is the extent to which the West will support not just the restructuring of Ukraine, the rebuilding of Ukraine, but the rebuilding of Ukraine's military capacities. Russia's very concerned that they don't do that, but the European powers and states around Ukraine and the Ukrainians are very adamant that they have to rebuild themselves as a military force to stop Putin going further. Is that a key sticking point?
Absolutely. In the 28-point proposal that was initially put out, or was initially crafted by Witkoff and Kushner, the Ukrainians were allowed to have 600,000 person army. This was categorically unacceptable to the Russians. And then when you got the European 28-point counter proposal, the number went from 600,000 to 800,000. Needless to say, the Russians find that categorically unacceptable. And you want to understand, when they were negotiating at Istanbul after the war started, this is back in March, April of 2022, the Ukrainians were then talking about a number of 250,000, not 600,000 or 800,000. The Ukrainians were talking about 250,000 as the size of their military after you got a peace agreement. And the Russians said that that's just unacceptable. You can't have a military that's that large. They wanted a much smaller military. So you can see that the size of the Ukrainian military after you reach some sort of agreement, which you're not going to reach, has to be much lower than 600,000. And the Ukrainians, of course, and the Europeans are not going to want that.
Again, going back to this question of how does this end, how did the Europeans think that this is going to end? What do you imagine is the sort of European strategy, or is there even one, as to how this conflict stops?
I have no idea what the Europeans are doing. Look, Freddie, Trump is no longer willing to financially support Ukraine moving forward. And he shifted the burden of paying for Ukraine onto the shoulders of the Europeans. The European countries are facing significant debt crises. They don't have the money to pay for Ukraine next year, the year after, and certainly for the next 10 to 20 years. Where are the European governments going to get the money to support Ukraine? It's just not there. So they've concocted this scheme where they're basically going to steal Russian assets that are housed. These are the frozen assets that are housed in Belgium. And the Belgian government is unwilling to do this. And Euroclear itself, which holds these assets, is unwilling to do this. And there are just all sorts of people who think this is a gross violation of international law. It's going to have negative consequences for the international financial system and so forth and so on. They may get away with it, but I don't think it's a long-term solution to the problem. And it's going to cause more problems than it solves. So Trump has basically bailed out, and the Europeans are in no position to replace the United States as the principal supplier of money. And Ukraine is bankrupt. It needs money in the extreme. So I don't see what the Europeans are going to do. What are the Europeans going to do to rectify the manpower balance? What are they going to do to rectify the firepower balance? Is this money going to solve that problem? No. So you have the money problem, the manpower problem, the firepower problem, and the Europeans continue to play hardball with the Russians, who are winning on the battlefield. I just don't see what the story is here that leads to a happy ending for Ukraine.
Well, and for the broader region, the situation could become even more disturbing because if Europe is not willing to accept Russian demands, and as you say, if it's really a case of Ukraine losing now or more painfully later, then perhaps the only solution for Europeans is to actually provide firepower and manpower and actually get themselves into a hot conflict with Russia. It sounds outlandish, and it doesn't seem like any European state is willing to do it now. But the conflict will have to go one way or the other.
Hard for me to imagine the Europeans joining the fight. I mean, what are we talking about? Sending ground forces and air forces in to fight against the Russians? These would be NATO troops. I would assume that would involve NATO. The whole question of the threat of nuclear escalation would come racing to the fore. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, how well would those European armies do? The British Army is in pathetic shape. They have one armored division that is not capable of engaging in major conflict. What is the size of the German army? About 200,000 troops, not a highly efficient fighting force. The idea that the Germans and the British are going to go in there and tackle the Russians, I don't think so. So I just find it hard to imagine that the Europeans are going to join the fight.
Mm. But then again, I keep going back to how does it end then? Because I can see it's intractable, but otherwise it's just going to be, I mean, it can't just go on forever as a war with this number of people dying.
No, that's right. I think you'll have an armistice. You'll have a frozen conflict, much like you had in Korea. I think you're right. It can't go on forever. And I believe at some point the Ukrainians will say, we've had enough. The Russians will win an ugly victory. Exactly where that is, where the line is, the line between the two sides is drawn is hard to say. It may be the Dnieper River, and then with some adjustments in the south. Who's to say at this point? I don't know whether the Russians will end up capturing Odessa, but you can imagine what the front lines will look like, and it will be a very messy situation.
In that scenario, the Ukrainians and the Europeans would accept a smaller Ukrainian military force, much smaller than the one they're currently proposing.
No, I didn't say that. You'll have a frozen conflict, not a meaningful peace agreement. The 600,000, 800,000, 250,000 number for the size of the Ukrainian army is what you care about if you're negotiating a peace deal or a peace agreement. There's no peace agreement or peace deal to be had here, at least that I can see at this point in time. I hope I'm wrong. We're talking instead about simply an armistice. And once you have an armistice, the size of the Ukrainian military is up to Ukraine itself. and its supporters in the West. There's no meaningful peace agreement in this scenario.
Lastly, John, let's look at the American side of the equation. Trump does seem to be threatening to withdraw US support. I don't think he's fully done that yet. But it seemed as though there was an interesting split politically within the Trump administration between Republicans who want to back Ukraine more and Republicans who want to say to Ukraine, accept this deal or accept whatever deal we come up with, or we're going to stop supporting you entirely. I don't know what your reading of it was, but I read some interesting things last week about the role that Marco Rubio played. And Marco Rubio is a figure of some suspicion among more America First Republicans who regard him as a sort of a neocon who hasn't entirely changed his spots. And there's a suspicion that J.D. Vance and Dan Driscoll, the new Secretary for the Army, were going to strike a deal. Were going to force the Ukrainians to accept a deal, or try to force the Ukrainians to accept a deal. And that wasn't going very well. And then Rubio came and sort of softened it up and made sure that no progress was made. Is that your reading of it, or do you think it was more dead on arrival from the beginning?
Well, as I said to you before, I think the agreement that is laid out in the 28-point proposal that leaked was dead on arrival for the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans. But getting back to the United States and what's going on there, I think the two principal obstacles since January 20th, when Trump moved into the White House, two principal obstacles have been Marco Rubio and Keith Kellogg. And Kellogg has now been pushed out, and he's been replaced by Dan Driscoll. And Driscoll is an ally of Vance. And Vance and I think Witkoff are the two key people on the other side. So it was really Vance and Witkoff versus Kellogg and Rubio. And now you have Driscoll on the other side. So it's 3-1. But the question is, does that mean that Trump is now going to cut a deal with Russia that basically gives the Russians pretty much everything they want? That's the only hope for getting a peace agreement, for Trump to do that. I don't think so. I think the resistance inside the United States, inside the Republican Party, and certainly the Democratic Party would make that impossible to do. But let's assume I'm wrong, and let's assume that Trump is able to cut a deal with the Russians that the Russians like, that he and Witkoff go to work, they have the backing of Vance and Driscoll, and we get a deal between the Russians and the Americans. Then the question is, can you get the Europeans and the Ukrainians on board? And it doesn't look to me at this point in time that you can do that. It's hard for me to imagine the Ukrainians buying on to a deal that gives the Russians pretty much everything they want. You have to understand that the Russians have extreme demands. I think you can understand why the Russians are making these demands. But nevertheless, if you're a Ukrainian looking at the Russian demands, this is not going to make you happy. And in fact, it's going to make you want to reject those demands. It's going to make you want to think that the Russians are an existential threat. This is the principal problem here. This is what's at the root of the problem that we now face getting a settlement. The fact is that the Russians have demands involving territory, size of the Ukrainian military, security guarantees, and NATO membership that are unacceptable to the Ukrainians and to many people in the West. So I think, again, my bottom line is even if Trump gets a deal or cuts a deal with Putin, he's not going to be able to sell it to the Europeans and the Ukrainians.
If the Russians are not going to budge from their maximalist demands, it's possible that they are offering Trump help in other ways. I mean, we saw this with Iran. After repeated phone calls with Putin, Trump talked about how Putin was going to help America in Iran. And there is some suspicion that the Russians are offering to help in Venezuela even. Does Russia have that kind of power, that ability to influence foreign policies in ways that would help Trump as far away as Venezuela?
I don't think the Russians can help him in Venezuela or help him in Iran. How could they help him in Iran? I mean,
I think the thinking was they would apply pressure on their allies. They have beneficial relationships with Iran, and that they would threaten to cut them off. But it didn't seem to happen.
yeah, I mean, the Russians don't trust Donald Trump as far as they can throw him. Uh, the Russians want to have good relations with Ukraine. Excuse me, they want to have good relations with China. They want to have good relations with North Korea, and they want to have good relations with Iran. They see these countries as strategic partners in their fight with the United States. You want to understand that the United States is at war for all intents and purposes with Russia in Ukraine. What we have tried to do in Ukraine, we meaning the United States and the Europeans, is bring the Russians to their knees. We've tried to defeat them on the battlefield in Ukraine and wreck their economy with economic sanctions. The Russians fully understand this. The Russians fully understand that any opportunity Donald Trump has to weaken Russia, he'll take advantage of that. They understand that Trump is now playing a weak hand, and that's why he's not playing hardball with the Russians like many people in the West would like him to do. But they understand that they have to have their guard up and they have to go to great lengths to check Trump at every point. And from a Russian point of view, having good relations with Iran is in their interest. With regard to Venezuela, the Russians just don't have much influence there. And what are the Russians going to do? Tell Maduro that he has to step down from power? I don't think they're going to tell Maduro that. And if they tell Maduro that, I don't think he's going to listen to the Russians because I don't think the Russians matter that much to him.
You say that the Russians think that Trump will try to hurt them at any chance he can. But isn't Trump's or the Trump administration's bigger priority China and trying to weaken China or slow down China's rise or China's increasing expansionism across the world, or whatever you want to call it, and that actually that's one of the reasons why Trump is willing to play nice with Russia as much as he can, is that he wants to peel Russia away from China.
The problem with Trump, Freddie, is that he changes his position every other day. Uh, I think that what you say is sometimes Trump's view. Other times, Trump talks like he's really interested in doing grievous damage to Russia. And you want to remember that he, in his first term, played hardball with the Russians. He came into office looking like he was going to do great things to improve relations between the United States and Russia, but it didn't turn out that way. And as I said before, he is the president who decided to provide offensive arms to the Ukrainians in 2017. He was as tough on the Russians as his predecessors and his successor.
Do you think that's because he was always being called a Russian asset, and there was the whole Russiagate story was dominated his first term?
Yes, I do believe that. I do believe that that's what happened. I believe that when Trump came into office, what he wanted to do was what you described before. He wanted to get tough with China, which he did. You remember, he abandoned engagement and he developed or adopted a containment policy vis-a-vis China. So he fundamentally changed our policy there. And I believe that he, in his first term, wanted to fundamentally change our relationship with Russia so that the United States and Russia had good relations and Russia was on our side of the ledger against China. I believe that that was Trump's goal. And he failed with regard to Russia. And I believe he failed for the reasons that you laid out, which is the whole Russiagate business came to haunt him and he had to constantly show toughness on Russia. But if you're in Moscow and you look at what the Americans are doing, you really don't care what their ultimate reason is for playing tough with Russia. All you care about is that the United States is playing tough and is trying to harm you. And given that, plus the fact that Trump has a mercurial foreign policy making, or he has mercurial views on foreign policy, you just can't trust the guy.
Well, finally, John, I would like to try and book you in for this time next year, if it's still possible, to do an Americano. And I don't want to force you to make predictions, but do you think there's any chance that we will be in the frozen conflict phase by this time next year? Or will the conflict be just the attritional war that you've described? Will it still be rumbling on?
Well, I would clearly bet that we'll be in the frozen conflict phase a year from now. Now, am I saying that I'm 100% certain that I'm right? Of course not. But I think given where Ukraine is today, and given where the balance is likely to be over the next couple months, I find it hard to imagine that Ukraine will still be fighting a year from now.
John Mearsheimer, it's always a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for coming on to Americano.
You're welcome, Freddie, and thank you very much for having me on the show.